Hi, I'm Adam Summer. You're listening to the Yerushalmi Talk podcast with the support of the Yeshivat Devar Yerushalayim in Har Nof, Jerusalem. This is Berechot, Chapter 6, Halacha 1, Part 3 of the Shir. Yesterday we were talking about fruit of the ground, blessing on the fruit of the ground, and today we're going to be talking about the difference between she'akol nid baro and fruit of the ground and cooking, what happens when you're cooking things. Now, one of the things to keep in mind is that there's always going to be a minimum measure for something in Judaism, and on the status of a bracha before you're eating something of a minimum measure and the bracha on after, you should not rely on what the Yerushalmi is saying on it, because it's a little bit not straightforward. The Yerushalmi is not exactly straightforward on what it's talking about for what the halacha l'maisa would be. It's talking about some principles, and you can't. This is too nuanced to look at this and extrapolate this out to be the halacha l'maisa for everything. So you always want to check the Mishnah Brura, and you always want to ask a posek on it. And on some of the brachas, you're going to get some different answers on cases about minimum measure, because on one hand, it's going to get back to this argument of, well, what happens if something was created in the 6 days as an entire entity? What's going to be the status? And some poskim are going to be ruling like this, but others will not be. And so you have to check carefully. As always with the Yerushalmi is not always talking about halacha l'maisa. A lot of times it is, but not always. A lot of times it'll be talking about something that will be nuanced. Sometimes it will be talking about a broader principle. Sometimes it will be talking about something that's related to another topic. This is the Talmud. It's very important to learn. It helps us to get a picture for what the halacha l'maisa would be and what it would be based on. And it gives us an idea about the principles so that we can understand the logic about how the halacha l'maisa would be getting made. Now, one of the amazing things about the Yerushalmi is that, yes, you want to be looking at the Bavli as well. And a great reason why you want to look at the Yerushalmi on things as well is because a lot of times they'll be talking about things that are not discussed in the Bavli altogether. For instance, can you go and you tell me in chapter 2, if you look in the Bavli in Rosh Hashanah and you look at the last two Mishnahs in chapter 2 of Rosh Hashanah in the Bavli, can you tell me what those Gemaras are? And the answer is that those last two Mishnahs don't have Gemaras in the Bavli. But if you open up the Yerushalmi, you will see Gemaras on it, and you will see explanations about it. And another thing is, if you look in chapter 7, Halacha 1, in Shabbat, Masechet Shabbos, there will be a line from Rabbi Yochanan, who just says one line on a question of, well, if you're making a sin on Shabbos, and you're making many, many, many of them, but they're all different sorts of averas with different malachas, different avot. Well, how many chatasas would you bring? And Rabbi Yochanan gives a one-word answer. He answers it. But what you don't see in there is you don't see the conversation between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Akiva that takes place over many, many dafs in the Yerushalmi parallel to go through and how you get at that answer, just like what Rabbi Yochanan says. Rabbi Yochanan gives Rabbi Akiva's answer, but you don't see the give and take on how that answer is derived. And you just see what is the answer. And it's very good. That's the answer. But you don't see the hard work and the math that went into it in order to see what that answer is. So one of the things here when you were working on the Yerushalmi is it's not that, we worked on something and it wasn't the halacha l'maisa. A lot of times you are doing the hard work and the footwork to get these sorts of ideas and principles. And a lot of times it might not be used in the halacha l'maaseh at all, but it helps you understand the topic in a deeper, richer way. I was learning yesterday in Bavli Yevamos, and it was talking about how one of the things that they talk about when they're converting somebody, when they're about to convert somebody, is they'll talk about leket, shchicha, and peah. And the reason that they do that is because these mitzvahs are very hard to understand for a non-Jew. For a Jew, you have to do it because the Torah says so. It's a reflection of divine will. It's a reflection, the mitzvahs are all reflections of divine will. But whether it makes sense or not doesn't matter. You have to do it because it's a reflection of the divine will. We were talking about that in chapter 5 when we were dealing about different heresies. Now, one of the cases about looking at the technical details of leket, shchicha, and peah and going through, and because if a non-Jew steals even something greater than a peruta, then they have issues of death, and it's very easy to just ignore the halachot on leket, shchicha, and peah, which they don't have to give as a non-Jew. And now you're saying that, okay, now you have to give these away as gifts to the poor, and they're not your property. They don't come into your possession. And when you were a non-Jew, they were your possession. Now they don't even belong to you, and you have to give them away. And the idea that in Yevamos, what it was talking about and why a convert will be told these laws is because it doesn't make sense to a non-Jew who wants to convert because of it's already going to be their property, and now you're saying it's not their property. That's what the Meforshim are saying about it. Well, if you're studying leket, shchicha, and peah, and you're going through the technical details of why is this grain over here going to be shchicha, but not that grain over there? Why is that bundle going to be shchicha, but not this bundle? Why is it that if you're taking you have a pile of leket and you're taking a pile of grain and putting it on top of the leket to quote unquote hide it, why is that going to be a problem? Well, you're not doing anything wrong if you're a non-Jewish farmer and you're doing that, right? Because that's not somebody else's property. But in this case, it would be, and it's harder to understand. And it's the same thing here. We want to work on these principles because a lot of these principles, especially now when we're getting into brachas, are going to be really important for you to get a deeper understanding in Judaism so that even if something here is not going to be the halacha l'maaseh, it's worth doing. Now, the Gemara gets into this position about Rabbi Yochanan, and we're going to get into this idea of cooked fruits and vegetables. Rabbi Chia Barva said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, over a pickled olive, one recites Borei Pri Ha'etz. Now, what's interesting about that is, halachically speaking, if you pickle something, it's going to have a certain effect that's going to make it like cooking. And in fact, it's going to have the same status as being cooked in the halacha. So this statement by Rabbi Chia Barva demonstrates that Rabbi Yochanan holds that cooked produce retains its original blessing, which would be Borei Pri Ha'etz or Borei Pri Adama. Okay, so what's going on over here? Because this seems to be a contradiction. In other words, a pickled thing should be cooked, and a cooked food should have something else. So Rabbi Binyamin Bar Yefes says in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, over a cooked vegetable, one recites She'akol Ni Bidvaro. So the Gemara now is going to cite support for Binyamin Bar Yefes. And Rabbi Shmuel Bar Rav Yitzhak says a Mishnah supports Rabbi Binyamin Bar Yefes that cooked vegetables do not retain their status as fruit of the ground, for we learned in a Mishnah, one fulfills the mitzvah of eating maror on the first night of Pesach, whether it's a bitter herb that's going to be used, whether it's going to be moist or dry. And the Gemara continues, says, but not if they are pickled or cooked extensively, or cooked normally. Gemara continues and says, now if cooked vegetables are deemed to be in their original fruit of their ground state, a person should discharge with them his obligation to eat maror on Pesach. So the question is, look, the Mishnah is ruling to the contrary, and that would prove that cooking transforms the vegetable into something new and a different product, which is no longer the same vegetable as was being talked about in the Torah. And that, by the way, would be what Rabbi Binyamin Bar Yefes was saying in the name of Rabbi Yochanan. But in the Bavli, in the parallel in 38b, Rabbi Chia Bar Abba, who, by the way, here is Rabbi Chia Bar Va, is citing that Rabbi Yochanan's ruling that one recites Borei Pri Adama over cooked vegetables. So that's going to be a difference between Bavli Yerushalmi and who said it. And the Gemara is going to try to narrow in on the fine points of this, because in the case of Rabbi Chia Bar Va in the Yerushalmi, over a pickled olive, it would be Borei Pri Etz, and over a cooked vegetable, it would be Sheakol Nieh Bidvaro. So that's going to be interesting. What's going on with the fruit that would make it different? Rabbi Zera says in the Gemara, how can you ever consider that Rabbi Binyamin Bar Yefes, that his version is going to be the correct one? And why? Who knew better the teachings of Rabbi Yochanan? Would it be Rabbi Chia Bar Va or Rabbi Binyamin Bar Yefes? And he answers, he says, was it not Rabbi Chia Bar Va? So the Gemara is basically implying that in a disagreement on what Rabbi Yochanan said, that we should follow Rabbi Chia Bar Va over Rabbi Binyamin Bar Yefes because he's the closer student. He's the greater Talmud of Rabbi Yochanan. And the Gemara continues, says, furthermore, even apart from Rabbi Chia Bar Va's greater reliability in regard to the teachings of Rabbi Yochanan, support for the actual law cited by Rabbi Chia Bar Va can be brought from the following: from that which we see great rabbis regularly enter to a mourner's meal and take and eat turmos beans and recite Borei Pri Adama, blessing over them. Now, are not turmos beans cooked? Surely they are. So we see that the proper blessing on cooked vegetables is going to be Borei Pri Adama. And the Gemara continues, says, and if you will say that nevertheless, the Mishnah regarding Maror refutes the ruling of Rabbi Chia Bar Va, as stated before, we answer, it is different in the case of Maror, for the Torah stated that one must eat bitter herbs. That's going to be in Exodus 12:8, where it says, together with bitter herbs they shall eat. That's going to be for where they're talking about the Pesach offering. And the Gemara says, and once the herbs have been cooked, their bitterness has been nullified. And the idea here is that, says the Haredim, the cooked vegetables retain their status as fruits of the ground and remain vegetables prescribed by the Torah. And the reason they are unfit for the mitzvah of maror is because the Torah requires the vegetables to be bitter. That's going to be d'oraita. And once they get cooked, it takes the bitterness out of them. Now, until this point, the Gemara has understood the two rulings, one by Rabbi Chia Bar Va and one by Rabbi Binyamin Bar Yefes, to contradict each other. But the question is going to be, do they have to contradict each other at all? Again, one is talking about fruit of the ground and one is talking about the tree. Now, the Gemara is going to get into a discussion where they're actually not contradicting each other at all. And Rabbi Yosef, son of Rabbi Avin, says, Rabbi Chia Bar Va and Rabbi Binyamin Bar Yefes are not arguing regarding an olive, since it was generally eaten raw. Even if it's pickled, it is still deemed to be in the original state. So even after it has been pickled, a Borei Pri Etz is recited over it That's what Rabbi Chia Barva said. And a vegetable, on the other hand, says Gemara, since it's not eaten raw usually, once somebody cooks it, is considered transformed into a new and different product, and it is no longer the original fruit of the ground, and therefore the she'akol is going to be recited over it, and that is what Rabbi Binyamin Bar Yefes is saying. So basically over here, there's going to be no disagreement at all. They're talking about one being from the fruit of the tree and one being from the fruit of the ground. And by the way, it helps us with this reasoning to understand the Korban Pesach better and the bitter herb better. In other words, it's getting us to understand why the bitter herb is going to be served the way it is, and why the bracha would be the way it is, and why we don't cook it. Now, normally vegetables are not going to be edible in the raw state. There's a lot of vegetables that you don't eat raw. Rhubarb is one of them. Another one that you don't eat raw would be selek, which is going to be like the greens that come from beets, and they're used. You cook them up; they're delicious. Another one that's not going to be like loof, which is going to be the leek. Nobody eats raw leek. There's no such dish where it's raw, except in China. They'll cut them very, very thinly into like a scallion and soak them in water for a long time and dry them and use it as a topping for some dishes in one part of China. But other than that, it's not really used in a raw state. And in fact, when I was living in China, the Chinese used to look at Westerners like they were crazy for eating salads. They thought it was totally crazy because the vegetables, grow in areas where there's animals and pollution, and who knows what the animals are doing there. And they're like, why you have to cook your vegetables before you eat them? You can't eat them raw; you'll get sick. So it's one is being grown in the ground, and one is being grown in a tree. So even over there in China, they would look at you as crazy for wanting to eat raw salads. I think over there now it's gotten a lot more popular as Western influences moved in. But when I was there, they really thought it was crazy to do, that it'd make you sick. Now, the idea is that normally you have to cook these and transform them into a new product from what it would be normally and naturally. And that's why they wouldn't hold the fruit of the ground status, and that's why you have to change it to a she'akol. That's the principle, that's the idea. And you can see more about that if you want to read the Mara Fulda to get more. Now, the Mara Fulda points out that Rabbi Yosef Bar Avin, he explains the two rulings attributed by Rabbi Yochanan, and that's going to, by the way, leave Rabbi Yochanan at odds with these other great rabbis who recited Borei Pri Adama over the cooked termos beans, which are unfit to be eaten raw. And those rabbis would disagree with Rabbi Yochanan, holding that, like Rabbi Zera in the name of Shmuel, who maintains that cooking never transforms a vegetable into a new and different product, even if it were taking something that would be inedible beforehand. Now, that's going to be the note by the Maro Fulda. Now, I want to look at what the Haredim says about this, because his explanation is a little bit different on why this would be. Now, the Haredim explains that Rabbi Yosef Bar Avin's reconciliation, according to this reading, is as follows. Olives are generally not eaten raw, but only picked. That's what the idea is. And the Haredim continues, says, since this is the usual way to eat olives, and the olive stands to be eaten this way, its blessing is going to be ha'etz. That's what Rabbi Chia said. The vegetables referred to by Rabbi Binyamin Bar Yefes, on the other hand, says the Haredim, are the kind that are best eaten raw. Hence, if one cooks them, he is considered to have affected them detrimentally, and the blessing would be demoted to she'akol. And by the way, that very logic is going to be stated by Rav Chizda in the Bavli 38b. So the dispute is going to be one where perhaps Rabbi Yochanan is referring to types of vegetables that would be downgraded when you cook them, and they would lose quality when you cook them, and perhaps it's like what this Bavli echoes, which is that one is best eaten raw, and it gets bad when it goes down when you cook it, and that's why it gets demoted to she'akol. And perhaps these beans can only be eaten in that status, and in fact, perhaps there's no contradiction at all. That would be the idea from the Haredim to try to reconcile this so that it's not at odds. The Mishnah states that on all fruits of the ground, one makes brei pri adama, except for bread. Now, this is going to be this pivotal idea in the Mishnah. And on the bread, we say hamotzi lechem min haaretz. Now, this in many ways is one of the deepest ideas in a Mishnah that you can find anywhere. This statement of except for bread. Because it gets into the 6 days, it gets into original sin in terms of, what happened when the first man made his sin and then had to leave the garden and then had to make bread. And this is part of the curse when Hashem says you will work from the sweat of your brow. And the idea is that bread is different from regular animal food. There's a Midrash Rabbah that has a story where Adam is complaining to Hashem that, I'm going to be like an animal. I'm just going to eat from a trough. I'm going to eat grass. And I'm going to do something that's no different than a donkey. I'm putting in the donkey part, but you get the idea. And the point is, Hashem's reply is a deep one. He says, no, you're going to eat the grass of the field, but you're going to have to process it. And so it's going to make you different from just like that donkey or other animal, that you're going to have something where your intelligence is going to have to come into it. And not only that, deeper than that, in order to get the grain, you're going to have to pray. You're going to have to do the Shemona Esrei. You're going to have to believe in me. You're going to have to get close to me. And in order to do that, to get the rain, in order to get a yield, to be able to be fed. So your soul and your body and your spirit is going to be involved in order to get this kind of grass. And that's what's going to make bread different from anything else, and why bread is so special. Bread requires the person to be praying and God-fearing. It requires direct help from Hashem, and it requires something, that's going to be stated on Rosh Hashanah, and it's going to be something where, if you're not good, the rains will be withheld, and if you're not following, you're going to have famine, and it's going to be interwoven with virtue. And then you have to go out and you have to create tools with your intellect, and you have to work it, and you're going to have to not work on Shabbat, and you're going to have to organize your fields in a way to grow during, not grow during Shvius. And there's a lot that comes into getting a single slice of bread. There's a lot of prayer. There's a lot of avoda. There's a lot of hard work with trying to connect to Hashem with the Shemona Esrei. So that even if you're eating the bread from someone else that you bought from, grain that you bought from someone else, somewhere along the line, somebody was praying for Parnassah. And that's a very different expression. So except for bread has a lot of meaning and a lot of agadic ideas that are in it. It's a very deep idea. Now, the Gemara is going to discuss the precise formulation for the blessing over bread. Rabbi Yaakov Bar Acha says Rabbi Nehemiah and the rabbis argue regarding the precise text of the blessing. And Rabbi Nehemiah says one recites Hamotzi Lechem Min Haaretz, and the letter with the Hey, Ha, is going to be added to the word Motzi. And what's that going to do? That's going to, this is a deep idea, okay? Rabbi Nehemiah is saying, Ha Motzi Lechem Min Haaretz, okay? And this idea of adding the Hey to the Motzi, it has this connection that Hashem is going to bring forth finished bread from the ground in the future. And the idea is that in the world to come, finished bread loaves will grow from the ground. That's a very agadic idea. You can see that in the Midrash in Berechot Rabbah 15:7. And that gives an explanation about what's going to be happening over in the time of the future, that bread is going to grow like that. I want to point out a note by the Rashba that's going to be cited elsewhere about this. And the Rashba is saying that the acts of kindness for which we praise Hashem in our blessings are ongoing. And Hashem constantly creates the fruits of the tree and of the ground, and constantly brings forth bread from the ground. And accordingly, the blessings are recited in the present tense, where it says, who creates the fruit, or where it says, who brings forth bread from the ground. Now, I want to point out, why would that be? Well, because we have a God who is continuously creating. We have a God who exists outside of time and space, and a God that is beyond human understanding. And in fact, even no angel could understand Hashem. And that if you could understand Hashem, you would pop into non-existence. It's not possible. And one of the ideas is that we have this idea of divine emanation, that everything is flowing like through a fountain of water that's continuously flowing from the source. And the idea is that we have a God who is continuously emanating reality. And in fact, when Moshe Rabbeinu goes up and asks, what's your name, at the burning bush, at the sneb, then you get this answer of something with the verb lichios, which is to be. In other words, that God is effectively saying that I am existence and reality. I am being. And so that's why he's unknowable, right? Is because God is the only thing that is existence itself, and nothing else can be above that or before that. And so we've never come in contact with anything else that is being itself. We are created things. We are an entity, and everything is a created thing, except God himself is being itself. And that is the idea when Hashem replies and says, I will be that I will be. In other words, with this idea of lichios, of being. And so with this idea of continuous creation through divine emanation, that we're getting these this appreciation of this continuous creation by Hashem, who is being itself. And that is a deep, profound idea. And if you want to learn more about it, you can read the books of the Ramchal. Now, Rabbi Nehemiah is trying to go a little further, and he's alluding to the future where Mashiach is going to be coming, and that the ongoing kindness of Hashem is going to be done in a way where, grain will be in a way fixed. In other words, that the sin will be fixed, and Hashem will change that so that mankind doesn't need to go and, as part of the curse, go and make the bread. In other words, because the sin has been fixed from this curse, from the banishment of Adam, in other words, Hashem is going to fix it where bread is going to be, actual bread that Hashem is bringing forth from the ground in the future, and that's going to be, an idea where, by putting the hay there, you're reciting with a future-leaning hamotzi. In other words, that this is looking toward a future where that first sin, which caused us to leave the garden, is going to be rectified, and creation is going to be rectified. And so then there's going to be no necessity to go and make bread the same way that we did. That's the idea of what Rabbi Nehemiah is saying, and it's a deep one. The Gemara is going to continue. It's going to say, but the rabbis say one recites motzi lechem min haaretz without adding the hay for the ha, to connote that Hashem brought forth finished bread from the ground in the past. In other words, before Adam's sin, finished loaves of bread were growing from the ground. And the idea is that after the sin, Adam was punished with this curse. You can see that in Genesis 3:19, where it says, by the sweat of your brow you shall eat bread. And as a result, bread no longer grew in a finished state, but rather in a form of grain. And as we know in Masechet Shabbos, you have to have a lot of labor and different kinds of labor in order to get your grain to grow. Now, you can go look in chapter 7 in Shabbos, and you can see all of the things that you have to do to get grain to get out. And then what do you do to use the grain? All of the avot and all of the labors that you would have to do in order to get grain into the form of flour and then into baking. So there's a lot of ideas about that. Now, the Yerushalmi is arriving at a solution where, it's talking about, an oddity in this text over the blessing of bread. Okay. Now, the question is going to be, why did the sages formulate the blessing where it's saying, who brings forth bread from the ground, right? So why is it saying, motzi lechem min haaretz, or hamotzi lechem min haaretz? So bread does not grow from the ground, and we know that grain grows from the ground. So why is it that the blessing isn't, who brings forth grain from the ground? And we learn here that the sages intended the blessing to contain an allusion to the actual loaves that at one time did grow from the ground before the sin, and what is going to be after the world gets fixed, after the world gets rectified and put back into this original state before the sin, where humanity elevates themselves with consciousness and understanding, and the Jews are observing, and the relationship with a Kodesh Baruch Hu is going to be closer, and the whole world is going to know Hashem, that the nature is going to change. And when the nature changes, one of the things that you're going to see in the change of nature is you're going to see something fundamentally different in the future world with bread. That's the idea here. Now, the Gemara is going to identify a dispute and with another dispute. The Gemara says, and those disputing opinions parallel the following disputing opinions, says the Gemara, for we learned regarding lephes, which is the Hebrew word for turnip. There is a dispute between Rabbi Chanina bar Yitzhak and Rabbi Shmuel bar Imi And one says the name Lephes implies, was this not bread, lo pas, in the past, before Adam sinned? The idea here, says Arash Cirilio, is that before Adam's sin, finished loaves grew in the size of a large turnip and in the form of a large turnip. And the name Lephes is meant to denote, does this not resemble the finished loaf of bread that once grew at this very size and form? So that's a deep insight about Lephes, where he's saying it's like lopas, and that it was like a representative of something that was basically in this size and shape before the sin. Gemara continues, it says, and another one says, Lephes implies, is this not destined to bread, lo pas, in the future? And the Rosh Cirilio explains about this, that in the world to come, finished bread loaves will grow in the size and the form of a large turnip. And the name Lephes is meant to connote that does this not resemble the finished loaves that will be in the future world in this very size and form? Very deep insight. The Gemara now is going to bring scriptural support for this assertion that in the future actual bread is going to grow from the ground. And again, why would this be? This is going to be because you have rectified the creation. You put things back into the original state of creation, both with the relationship and observance of Hashem, and with how you are seeing the world and operating with the world. And because of that, the nature itself will change. That's the idea. And in fact, one of the things that we're going to get up into in the end of Masechah Shabbos is with homosexuality. And the sages are going to say, why are there earthquakes? And the sages are going to say, because of homosexuality in that area. There's a lot of homosexuality in the area. And we know that, the Torah says it's a toivah, and we know that it's a sexual perversion. It's not just a sexual perversion, but it's one that goes against the nature. In other words, that it is nature to have sexual desire. That's how Hashem created us. But the problem with that sin is that you're taking your nature and you're twisting it into something that is abominable with something that is outside of the nature. So a couple of things that are, by the way, next to each other in the Torah that are taking a normal, natural urge and then twisting it into something abominable that is outside of nature is something like bestiality and something like homosexuality. Now, the other sins with sexual things that's listed in the Torah, like if somebody were to be interested in their father's sister, for example, well, the Torah says that that's not allowed, but you're doing that because the Torah says it's not allowed. Now, before Har Sinai, the people used to do that stuff, and they were taking a natural sexual desire, and they were using it. However, it's in it was in a family kind of relationship that is forbidden by the Torah. The problem with bestiality and homosexuality is that you are taking a naturally created urge and you're using it in an unnatural way. And that is going to be a problem. And that's why it's going to shape nature and affect nature and create this corruption that creates earthquakes and the shaking of the ground. And we see that it does get affected. In fact, before they had the Katrina hurricane in Louisiana, a month before, they had the homosexual convention there. And what happened a month later? You had Katrina. And there's other cases where you have natural disasters and you have things occur in a natural way. I'll give you an example. There was a famous earthquake that happened in China when I was living there. I think it was in 2012 2012 or 2011, and it was an earthquake in the middle of the Sichuan province. And when they look at the epicenter of exactly where the earthquake started from, it was exactly under the equivalent of the Vatican for Taoism, for the Taoist religion, which is Mamash Avodah Zarah. And everything the Torah says not to do, they do. They do things with seances with the dead, and they try to speak to dead spirits, and they do sorcery and magic. Everything the Torah says not to do, they do. And where did this earthquake happen? And you can look it up for yourself, and you can see it in all the news sites. It happened exactly under that building, which is a very big, fancy building, and it totally demolished it. And it demolished the region which worships that abomination religion. Now, here we're seeing a case where we're talking about a fixing of the creation. We're talking about a fixing of the creation back, and once the behavior of the civilization and the people and the Jews goes back to a performance and a recognition and a vision of how things are supposed to be done during those first 6 days and 7 days, then what happens is the nature itself is going to change as well. And that's how we're getting into this idea about the earth coming and changing the creation and how bread rolls will work. Now we see in Masechet Peah in chapter 7, Halacha 3, we see the other case where as the Jews were sinning, we could see that they had very nice peach trees, and from the same owners, as the owners were sinning more and more, these peach trees started to have rotten fruit or small fruit and fruit that didn't even taste very good, which is a compounding that the nature itself changed to where the produce wasn't good and it rotted, and not only that, the quality wasn't good as well. So we see that happening for sin, and we see that happening as you're getting closer to Hashem. Now, the Gemara is going to bring this support on where in the future actual bread is going to go from the ground. The Gemara says, it is written, there shall be fisas bar. In other words, that's going to say a hand-sized bread roll growing on the earth on the mountaintops. This, by the way, is in Tehillim 72:16, where it's going to be basically creating a cognate of the word pas hayar, where it's going to be saying pisat. And that's basically going to be saying that it's going to basically be playing with that word to say like pisat bar. Bar means grain, by the way. You can see that in Daniel in 5:5. And basically what this is literally saying is that there's going to be abundant grain. And the abundant grain is going to be as wide as the palm of the man's hand. And basically, since the palm of the hand can't be grain, it has to be bread. That's the idea. In other words, where it says in Tehillim 72:16, it says pas hayar, and that's basically saying the palm of the hand. Okay, well, we know that grain doesn't grow that way, so it's going to be basically finished bread. And the idea in Berechot Rabbah is going to be that it's going to be that where a case where loaves are going to be finished from the ground and growing from the ground in the future. But the question is going to be, well, what exactly was the tree of knowledge? And the idea is that, well, one of the potential tree of knowledge was actually going to be a wheat tree. Now, Adam can't grow wheat and turn it into grain and turn it into flour and turn it into something that you can mill and turn it into bread. So if the idea is that Adam was eating from the tree of knowledge, which is going to be from wheat, well, he can't eat grains of wheat, right? It doesn't do anything. The idea is that it had to have been like a wheat tree, and that's going to be where the it was growing actual loaves of bread. Now we know that in Berechot in chapter 3 pasuk 6 it says the woman saw and the tree was good for eating, and we know that wheat as it is today is not good for eating. You have to process it. So this idea is that, it has to be that the tree grew actual loaves of wheat. Actual wheat loaves, which is going to be bread. And that's going to be the idea here. That's how they're getting it. The Gemara is now going to get into further explanation about it. And Rabbi Yerushalmi cited a blessing over bread in the presence of Rabbi Zera with the text, Ha motzi lechem min haaretz, and Rabbi Zera praised him for it. Now, the Gemara is going to ask a question. It says, Ma? What? And it says that he acted in accordance with the minority opinion of Rabbi Nehemiah. And unlike the rabbis who dispute him, Rabbi Zera praised him. The Gemara is going to answer that Rabbi Yerushalmi and Rabbi Zera had a different understanding of the dispute between Rabbi Nehemiah and the rabbis that gets presented. Rabbi Yerushalmi and Rabbi Zera maintain that the dispute between Rabbi Nehemiah and the rabbis is as follows. Rabbi Nehemiah holds that one should recite Hamotzi so as not to merge the two letters mem at the extremities of the words where it says ha'olam and motzi. And the rabbis, on the other hand, are not concerned about this getting merged. Now, normally, there's you have a succession of words, and there's an M that starts where it says ha'olam, and a mem sound that starts for motzi, and you tend to blend them together. The problem with blending things together like that is now you didn't actually say the blessing. You've blurred the meaning. Now, Rabbi Yerushalmi, where he says hamotzi, okay, and gets praised by Rabbi Zera, the idea is that it's not an argument about whether there's going to be, an illusion in this bracha for finished bread and the bracha. Now, even the rabbis might agree that there's going to be finished bread in the bracha, but they're saying that it should stay where it's talking about the finished bread of the past instead of talking about it in the future. Even if the rabbis agree that in the future it will be different, the idea that Rabbi Zera is pointing out is that maybe the dispute actually has a different matter altogether. In other words, not talking about whether we should be phrasing it like talking about the bread in the past state, or whether it's going to be talking about the bread in the future state, but rather, perhaps, the idea is not to mingle the words together, to merge them together, because you could create a different meaning, or you could actually nullify the blessing by blending them together and not saying anything at all. And in Judaism, if something is said as gibberish, you didn't say anything. That's the halacha. If you're saying something that is gibberish, the halacha is that you didn't say anything at all. For instance, if somebody makes a netter, and it's a netter that they can't do, well, it's gibberish and it's not binding. You didn't affect anything. So the idea is going to be that there's a concern, and Rabbi Nehemiah is going to be worried that perhaps you're going to be messing up the meaning of this blessing. And the idea is that maybe the rabbis are not concerned about this mingling of the two mems where you're messing up the meaning. The Gemara is going to explain why it itself did not explain the dispute Why didn't the Gemara explain it like what Rabbi Zera was saying, what Rabbi Yirmiyah did? Gemara says, if it is so that the reason of Rabbi Nehemiah maintaining one recites Hamotzi as not to merge the letters at the extremities of Ha-Olam and Motzi, Rabbi Nehemiah should also maintain that one should recite Lechem Hamin Haaretz rather than Lechem Min Haaretz, so as not to merge the letters at the extremities of the words Lechem and Min. In other words, if Rabbi Nehemiah's worry is that the merging of the letters for the mem would be a problem, then, hey, you have over here where it says Haolam and Motzi, and if you said Hamotzi, well, that's not a solution because the same problem comes up when you go down, further along in the blessing, because later on it says Lechem and Min. So, you have a mem and a mem. And over here, there's also going to be an issue about merging the mem sounds. So what about it? That's basically the objection. Now, the idea is going to be that, well, maybe the Gemara really intended the original explanation of Rabbi Nehemiah. So let's look at what Rabbi Nehemiah says. Gemara says, according to Rabbi Nehemiah, who rules that one recites Hamotzi to allude to the bread of the world to come, so too one recites over wine Ha Bore Pri Hagafen. Whereas according to the rabbis, who rule that one recites Motzi to allude to the bread which grew before Adam's sin, one recites wine where it says Bore Pri Hagafen. So over here, we see that the rabbis are holding that finished bread came from the earth before Adam's sin. And we hold that finished wine also came forth from the trees before Adam's sin. And Rabbi Nehemiah is saying that the finished bread is going to come forth in the world to come, and so will wine. Finished wine will be coming forth from the trees in the world to come too. Now, you can make the same argument about the wine. The Mishnah says, except for wine. Now, one of the key things about this is that, hey, if one of the forbidden trees was going to be the vine, well, it's very hard work to make wine. You have to take the grapes. You have to press the grapes. You have to ferment the grapes, and then you can have wine. So if it were a case where the tree of knowledge was going to be a fruit vine for wine, well, it must be that finished wine was being grown in the same way with the same logic as well, because guess what? It takes a lot of work of processing. And just like the grain and the wheat and the bread takes a lot of work for processing, so too does wine. So it had to have been done in a finished state. And so that's the idea of what Rabbi Nehemiah and the rabbis are arguing about. They all agree that, guess what? We agree that this grew in a finished state, but should it be where we're talking about the original state, or should we talk about where we're talking about the state in the world to come? The Gemara is going to cite a question regarding the blessings over foods. Rabbi Zerakon says, Rabbi Zera inquired concerning one who has a bowl of turmos beans before him, and he intends to eat the entire bowl, and he takes an individual turmos bean in his hand, and he recites a blessing over it, and it falls from his hand, and he's unable to eat it. What is the law insofar as having to recite a blessing a second time over the remaining beans? In other words, he dropped the first one he made the bracha on, and he can't get it. Do you have to make a bracha on the remaining beans? The Gemara now is going to be puzzled by the uncertainty of this question. And the Gemara says, what is the difference between this case and the case of one who recites a blessing when drinking from a flowing water channel? And in a case of a flowing water channel, the water that was before him when he recited the bracha flowed away from him, and he can't ever drink it because it's past him now. Nevertheless, he drinks the water that comes in its place without reciting another blessing. That's going to be a deeper idea on the nature of blessings. In other words, that this is out of your hand, but this now, this other water comes to you. Okay, it helps you to get a deeper understanding of how brachas work. Now, if you drink from a flowing water channel, you know from before you sit down and you do that the exact water that you made the bracha on flowed past you, and new water is going to be there when you pick up the water. But you're not saying a bracha over the water that's presently before you. You're actually saying it over the water in general, even though that water in general is going to be replaced. So also, if somebody drops the bean, you're not saying it over the intent to say it on that specific bean. You're saying it in general about the beans in front of you, even if that particular bean is no longer usable. Now, the Gemara is going to answer, and it's going to say, they say there, in the case of the water channel, he intended for that from the outset. However, in the case of the dropped bean, he did not intend that from the outset. In other words, he didn't mean to drop the bean. He knew with the water channel, the nature of the water channel, but he didn't know that with the bean. And the Gemara is going to resolve this, and it's going to say, come learn the answer. Rabbi Chia taught a brisa. One does not recite the blessing over the bread except at the time that he breaks the bread. In other words, one should not first break off a piece of bread from the loaf and then say the blessing. Rather, he says the blessing while the bread is still whole, and then he breaks the bread and he completes the blessing, because if he first breaks off a piece and then he recites a blessing, the blessing will be considered to have been only on that piece. But if the person then would happen to lose that piece, before he gets a chance to taste it, he would need to recite another blessing over that remaining bread. But if you, and by the way, it would be a problem because you have a bracha lavatala, you've taken a vain blessing. Now, if he recites the blessing he breaks over bread, then that blessing is considered over the entire loaf. That's the idea. So even if one piece gets lost, well, it doesn't matter because he has the remaining loaf there. There's going to be another Amarah who's going to talk about this brisa. It's going to say, Rabbi Chia Barva said, this brisa of Rabbi Chia says in effect that one who takes a roll and recites a blessing over it, and before he can take a bite of it, it falls and does not come to his hand, and he cannot find it, he must recite a blessing a second time over the rolls. And the Gemara adds and says, Rabbi Tanhum Bar Yudan says, since the first blessing is invalid, he must say, blessed is the name of the glory of his kingship forever and ever. And why would that be? So it would be so that the name of heaven is not taken in vain. And we're trying, it's a sin to utter Hashem's name in vain. And there's a formula for that is talked about in Trumos 3b in the Art Scroll in Masechet Truma. That's going to be in chapter 1, halacha 1. And since you're saying a blessing over the bean that you lost or a piece of bread from the roll, it's going to be invalid, and you have to say another blessing. But it emerges that the name of Hashem is uttered when you said the first blessing, and that was done for nothing. So that would be a problem because you're saying Hashem's name in vain. And the idea is that one proclaims the praise, blessed is the name of glorious kingdom for all eternity, so that the utterance of the name should have been uttered in conjunction with the praise. And this is noted in Trumos as a method to fix an unwarranted utterance of Hashem's name in case somebody inadvertently said an invalid blessing. That's the idea, and that's what the also the Tosafot in Berechot also recommends that in order to fix it. That's going to be the idea. So it's very serious with these brachas, and it's very serious to get these right, and it's very important to get these right. Tomorrow we're going to get on to more about the blessing on bread and different kinds of foods, but there's a lot going on here, and it's a very deep agadic thing about what was and what will be, and what is the nature of the creation, what is the nature of the world that you're living in. And in Masechet Sukkah and the Yerushalmi, it explains what the 36 hidden tzaddikim are seeing, how they're seeing the world and interacting with the world. And it's in the parallel, it's a Gemara in the parallel Mishnah in Masechet Shabbos in the Bavli, where Shimon Bar Yochai is explaining to his son that there's only 36 hidden tzaddikim, and in other words, he says that there are 36 hidden tzaddikim in the Bavli, but the Yerushalmi parallel explains what they're seeing and how they're seeing the world. And in fact, when the entire world is coming to know Hashem and see the world just like those hidden tzaddikim, those 36 hidden tzaddikim, that's when we're going to see the nature totally change in the world. And you're going to see physical changes in the nature as well. That's the idea of what this is saying and how it connects to you and the creation and the brachas. And we're living in a world where we manifest things into reality through the avoda and through the amida. And we manifest things into the world by cleaning ourselves up from sin and making ourselves more holy. And we bring things down into the world through this process of divine emanation, where Hashem gives us things because we're asking for it, and then we say a blessing on it. And that's how we have to live our life and recognize that. And when we do, we'll have peace in our life. Have a great day.